What happens when one of television's most respected journalists decides he's had enough of celebrity double standards and calls out a former royal live on national television? You're about to witness the most explosive interview in Good Morning America history, where George Stephanopoulos completely dismantles Meghan Markle's narrative with surgical precision. This is the moment that changed everything, so make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because you won't believe what unfolds. The Good Morning America studio felt different that morning. George Stephanopoulos sat across from Meghan Markle, his usual professional demeanor intact, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this wouldn't be the typical softball interview she was expecting. The cameras rolled, and what started as a routine promotional appearance for her latest venture quickly transformed into television gold. "Meghan, thank you for joining us this morning," George began, his voice steady and measured. "I want to start by addressing something that's been troubling me about your recent statements regarding media coverage." Meghan shifted slightly in her chair, her practiced smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Of course, George. I'm always happy to discuss the challenges of navigating media scrutiny, but here's what I'm struggling with," George continued, leaning forward slightly. "You've spoken extensively about wanting privacy, yet you've given multiple high-profile interviews, started a podcast, signed lucrative deals with streaming platforms, and now you're here promoting another project. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan's media-trained response was immediate. "Well, George, there's a difference between sharing our story on our terms and having false narratives spread about us. We have every right to correct the record and build our own platform." "But who determines what's false, Meghan?" George's voice remained calm, but his words carried weight. "Because I've been in journalism for over 30 years, and I've noticed a pattern where any coverage that isn't completely favorable gets labeled as false or racist. That's a serious accusation to make against an entire industry." Meghan's posture stiffened. "Are you suggesting that the documented racism I've experienced isn't real, George? Because I can assure you, it very much is." "I'm not questioning your experiences," George replied carefully. "What I'm questioning is the convenient timing of these revelations and how they seem to surface whenever there's criticism about other issues. You've built a brand around being a victim, but at what cost to the institutions and people you've publicly criticized?" The studio grew quieter, producers behind the cameras exchanging glances. This wasn't the gentle questioning they'd expected. Meghan's voice took on a sharper edge. "I think that's an incredibly unfair characterization, George. I've never claimed to be a victim. I've simply shared my truth about experiences that were genuinely harmful and difficult." "Your truth," George repeated slowly. "That's an interesting phrase, because truth, at least in journalism, isn't subjective. Either something happened or it didn't. Either someone said something or they didn't. You can't have multiple versions of truth." "But context matters, George," Meghan shot back. "The same words can mean different things depending on who's saying them and the environment they're said in. When you're the only person of color in a room full of people who've never had to think about race, your experience is going to be fundamentally different." George nodded thoughtfully. "Context absolutely matters. So let's talk about context. When you sat down with Oprah and made that explosive claim about conversations regarding your son's skin color, you provided no context, no names, no specifics, just a devastating accusation that painted an entire family as racist. Don't you think that family deserved the courtesy of context?" Meghan's eyes flashed with something that looked like anger. "We were very careful about how we discussed that situation. We never named anyone specifically because we didn't want to cause more harm than necessary." "But you did cause harm, didn't you?" George pressed. "You caused harm to people who couldn't defend themselves publicly. You caused harm to an institution that, regardless of its flaws, represents something important to millions of people. You caused harm while sitting safely in your California mansion, immune from the consequences of your words." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Meghan's composure cracked visibly. "How dare you," she said, her voice rising slightly. "How dare you suggest that I was safe? Do you have any idea what it was like living in that environment? Do you understand the mental health struggles I was dealing with? The complete lack of support?" "I don't doubt that it was difficult," George replied, his tone remaining infuriatingly calm. "But millions of people face mental health struggles every day without access to the resources, support systems, and platforms that you had. They don't get to air their family's private business on international television as a form of therapy." Meghan's hands clenched in her lap. So, because I had privilege, I wasn't allowed to struggle? Is that what you're saying? No, Megan. What I'm saying is that with privilege comes responsibility. And part of that responsibility is considering the impact of your words before you speak them. You had the power to destroy reputations, to damage relationships, to hurt people who cared about you. Did you consider that power before you used it? The question seemed to catch Meghan off guard. For the first time since the interview began, she was quiet for several long seconds. I considered it, she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. But at some point, you have to prioritize your own well-being and that of your family. Even at the expense of truth, George asked? Because that's what this comes down to, doesn't it? Your version of events versus everyone else's. And when everyone else's version doesn't match yours, they're automatically wrong, or biased, or racist. Meghan's media training kicked in, and she attempted to regain control of the narrative. George, I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation. The royal family is an institution built on tradition and protocol, and sometimes that protocol doesn't account for modern realities or diverse perspectives. But George wasn't finished. Let's talk about protocol. You knew what you were marrying into, didn't you? The royal family isn't a secret organization. Their expectations, their traditions, their way of life, it's all very well documented. So why did you seem so surprised by it all? The question about protocol hit its mark. Meghan's practiced composure was beginning to unravel as she realized this wasn't going to be another sympathetic interview where her narrative went unchallenged. I knew about the traditions, yes, she said slowly, but knowing about something intellectually and living it are two completely different things. Nobody can prepare you for what it's actually like to have your every move scrutinized, your every choice criticized. George raised an eyebrow. But you were an actress, Meghan. You were already in the public eye. You understood media attention, paparazzi, public scrutiny. What exactly caught you off guard? The level of it was completely different, Meghan insisted. And the way it was covered was different. When I was on Suits, the coverage was about my work, my career. When I joined the royal family, suddenly everything became about my race, my family background, my past relationships. Or maybe, George said carefully, it became about your behavior. Because let's examine the timeline, shall we? Within months of joining the royal family, there were reports of staff turnover, difficulties with protocol, tensions with other family members. Were all of those stories false? Meghan's jaw tightened. Staff turnover happens in any organization, George, and when you're trying to modernize an ancient institution, there's bound to be resistance. Modernize, George repeated. That's an interesting way to frame it. Because from the outside, it looked less like modernization and more like someone who expected an entire centuries-old institution to bend to their preferences. Did you ever consider that maybe you were the one who needed to adapt? The accusation hung in the air like a slap. Meghan's eyes flashed dangerously. So I was supposed to just accept being treated as less than? I was supposed to smile and stay quiet while people made racist comments and the institution did nothing to protect me? Again, with the racism allegations, George said, his voice taking on a slight edge. And again, no specifics, no context, no names. Just broad accusations that paint everyone around you as racist. Don't you see how convenient that is? Any criticism becomes racism. Any disagreement becomes persecution. It's not convenient, George. It's my reality. Meghan shot back. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But I can see patterns, George replied coolly. And the pattern I see is someone who has never been told no, who has never had to truly compromise, who expects the world to revolve around their needs and preferences. When that doesn't happen, it becomes everyone else's fault. Meghan's voice rose slightly. That is completely unfair, and you know it. I compromise constantly. I gave up my career, my independence, my identity to become part of that family. You gave up a supporting role on a cable television show, George said bluntly. Let's not pretend you were giving up an Oscar-winning career. And as for independence and identity, you've managed to monetize both quite successfully since leaving, haven't you? The direct attack on her career credentials clearly stung. Meghan straightened in her chair, her media training warring with her obvious anger. My work on Suits was meaningful to me and to many people who watched it. And yes, I've built a successful brand since leaving the royal family. But that's because I have something valuable to offer. Do you, though? George asked, tilting his head slightly. Because when you strip away the royal connection, What exactly are you selling? What unique expertise or talent do you bring to the table that justifies the massive deals and platforms you've been given? The question was brutal in its simplicity. Meghan opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find an answer that didn't sound hollow. I bring authenticity, she finally said. I bring a perspective that hasn't been heard before in these spaces. Authenticity, George mused. That's another interesting word choice, because authentic people don't usually have to keep telling everyone how authentic they are. Authentic people don't craft carefully constructed narratives about their victimhood. They just live their truth quietly and with dignity. Meghan's composure finally cracked completely. You don't know anything about living my truth, George. You don't know what it's like to have your mental health attacked, to have your family vilified, to have your children's security threatened because of who their mother is. Your children's security was never threatened by the royal family, George replied firmly. That's another convenient narrative that conveniently ignores the fact that royal security is some of the best in the world. Your children were safer as part of that family than they'll ever be as private citizens in California. How can you possibly know that? Meghan demanded. You weren't there. You didn't live through what we lived through. No, I wasn't there, George agreed. But I've covered the royal family for decades. I've seen how they operate, how they protect their own. And what I saw during your brief time, there was an institution bending over backwards to accommodate someone who seemed determined to be dissatisfied no matter what they did. Meghan shook her head vigorously. That's not true. They never protected me from the racist coverage. They never defended me when the press was attacking me daily. Because that's not how they operate, Meghan. They don't respond to press coverage. It's called dignity. It's called rising above. It's called understanding that engaging with every criticism gives it more power, not less. Easy to say when you're not the one being attacked, Meghan muttered. But you weren't just being attacked, were you? George pressed. You were also being praised, celebrated, welcomed by millions of people. You chose to focus on the negative voices instead of the positive ones. Why do you think that is? The question seemed to catch Meghan off guard again. She stared at George for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how to respond. Because the negative voices were louder, she finally said, and they had institutional power behind them. Or because victim narratives are more profitable than gratitude narratives, George suggested quietly. Because being the wronged party gets more sympathy, more attention, more opportunities than simply being grateful for extraordinary privilege. The accusation was devastating in its accuracy. Meghan's face flushed with anger, and something that looked like shame. How dare you reduce my experiences to profit motives? She said, her voice shaking slightly. How dare you suggest that I fabricated suffering for money? I'm not suggesting you fabricated anything, George replied, his voice maddeningly calm in contrast to Meghan's obvious distress. I'm suggesting you weaponized it. There's a difference between experiencing something difficult and turning that experience into a marketable brand. Meghan's hands were visibly shaking now, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the flush of anger and embarrassment spreading across her face. You're twisting everything I've said. You're making me sound like some kind of con artist. Am I? George asked, leaning back slightly. Because let's look at the facts. Within 2 years of leaving the royal family, you and Harry have signed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. All of those deals are predicated on your royal story, your victim narrative, your insider access to a family you've publicly criticized. If that's not monetizing trauma, what would you call it? I would call it taking control of our own narrative, Meghan shot back, but her voice lacked conviction. We have every right to tell our side of the story. Your side, George repeated. Always your side. Never the truth, never what actually happened. Just your interpretation of events filtered through your particular worldview. Don't you think that's problematic for someone who claims to care about honesty and authenticity? Meghan was struggling now, her media training completely abandoned, as raw emotion took over. What do you want from me, George? Do you want me to apologize for leaving an environment that was making me suicidal? Do you want me to pretend that everything was wonderful when it wasn't? I want you to take responsibility, George said, his voice cutting through her emotional appeal like a knife. I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences, that your words have power, that when you go on international television and make devastating accusations against people who can't defend themselves, that matters. They could defend themselves, Meghan protested weakly. They chose not to. Because they have class, George replied bluntly. Because they understand that dignity means not getting into public feuds with family members. Because they know that the more you engage with this kind of behavior, the more you legitimize it. The observation hit home. Meghan's face crumpled slightly, as if she was finally beginning to understand how her actions appeared to others. "So what was I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice smaller now. "Just suffer in silence? Just accept being treated poorly and never speak up?" "You were supposed to handle it privately," George said firmly. "You were supposed to work through family issues within the family. You were supposed to give the benefit of the doubt to people who welcomed you, supported you, and tried to help you succeed." "But they didn't help me succeed," Meghan insisted. "They set me up to fail." "Did they?" George challenged. "Or did you fail because you expected success to look exactly like what you wanted it to look like? Because you couldn't accept that being part of something bigger than yourself means sometimes your individual preferences don't matter?" The question hung in the air like a final verdict. Meghan stared at George, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response that wouldn't sound petulant or entitled. "You don't understand," she finally whispered. "You don't understand what it's like to lose yourself completely." "But you didn't lose yourself, Meghan," George said, his voice almost gentle now. "You just discovered that yourself wasn't as important as you thought it was. And instead of growing from that realization, instead of learning humility and service, you decided that everyone else was wrong." "Service," Meghan repeated bitterly. "Easy to talk about service when you're not the one being expected to smile while people tear you apart." "People in service positions get criticized all the time," George replied. "Police officers, teachers, healthcare workers, military personnel, they don't get to quit their responsibilities and then spend years publicly attacking the institutions they served. They understand that service means putting something bigger than yourself first. So, I was supposed to just take it forever? Never stand up for myself? Never protect my family?" "You were supposed to earn your place," George said simply. "You were given an extraordinary opportunity to make a real difference in the world. Instead of embracing that opportunity, you spent your time focused on whether people liked you enough, whether you were being treated fairly enough, whether you were getting enough credit." The accuracy of the assessment was clearly devastating. Meghan's eyes filled with tears that she was desperately trying not to shed on national television. "That's not fair," she said, but even she seemed to know how weak it sounded. "Life isn't fair, Meghan," George replied, "but some people are privileged enough to make it fairer for others. You had that privilege. You had the platform, the resources, the global attention to actually change things. Instead, you used all of that privilege to settle personal scores and build a brand around your own grievances." "I have made a difference," Meghan protested. "My advocacy work, my charitable efforts." "Your advocacy work consists mainly of talking about yourself," George interrupted. "Your charitable efforts are carefully curated photo opportunities that generate more publicity for you than help for the causes you claim to support. Even your activism is ultimately about you." The brutal assessment left Meghan visibly shaken. She sat in silence for several long moments, clearly struggling to compose herself. "You came here today expecting another platform to promote yourself," George continued relentlessly. "You expected me to nod along while you repeated the same tired talking points about racism and mental health and institutional failure. But someone needs to call out this performance for what it is." "Performance?" Meghan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, performance," George confirmed. "Because real pain doesn't need constant validation. Real trauma doesn't need to be monetized. Real growth happens quietly, through self-reflection and genuine service to others, not through tell-all interviews and streaming deals." Meghan finally broke completely, tears streaming down her face as years of carefully constructed narratives crumbled under George's methodical questioning. "I just wanted to be happy," she said through her tears. "I just wanted my family to be safe and happy." "Then you should have stayed," George said quietly. "You should have done the work. You should have learned that happiness isn't about getting everything you want. It's about finding meaning and service to something greater than yourself." The interview was effectively over. Meghan sat in stunned silence, finally confronted with a version of herself that she had spent years trying to avoid acknowledging. George had done what no other interviewer had managed to do. He had stripped away the carefully crafted victim narrative and exposed the entitled mindset underneath. As the cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Meghan's complete breakdown, it was clear that this interview would be remembered as the moment when one of the world's most skilled interviewers definitively dismantled one of its most controversial public figures. The truth, as George had said, wasn't subjective, and the truth about Meghan Markle had finally been revealed for everyone to see. That's the explosive interview that has everyone talking. What did you think of George's approach? Was he too harsh? Or was this exactly the kind of tough questioning that Meghan needed to face? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible moments like this one.